Hi, everybody. Welcome to Kindred Skulls. My name's Matt Freese. I'm here with my co-host Nick Olson. Missing you've been great, Greg Blake once again, but we're doing good here on this Wednesday evening. How are you doing, Nick?
I'm good. This is the Kirk Cousins episode, folks. I'm breaking my Kirk Cousins moratorium. I put a ban on all Kirk Cousins discourse. It's kind of where football analysis goes to die. People stop thinking. They close their minds. They just start shouting at each other. Well, this is the episode where I break my silence. I finally give my opinions. That was enough to drive Greg away. He said, "You know what? I don't want to be a part of this. I can't put my name in good grace on Kirk Cousins discourse." So unfortunately, we are missing Kirk or we are missing Greg tonight, but people will finally get to hear, our unfiltered thoughts, positives, negatives, and what we want to do with Kirk going forward. So I'm pumped to actually dive into this stuff because I've kept my tongue for too long. So
Yeah, I
um,
guess I buried the lead a little bit there, but you wanted to dive right into it. So, no,
I'm just so
seriously,
excited. I've got so much to say. I've had to not tweet about Kirk Cousins for like a month, and it's been good. It's been therapeutic. It's like a cleanse. It's almost like a religious vow of silence. I
it's
feel
hard
like
it's hard
I'm
to
coming
limit
out of this a
yourself
better
to
man.
those 280 characters, right? When you're talking about Kirk. So,
Exactly. And you want to there's a lot that there is to say about him. So I'm excited to dive in. I fixed my microphone, so thank you to everybody who managed to live through the wonderful clicking noises in our last two podcasts. If you're still with us and you endured all that and you haven't review bombed us on iTunes, we appreciate you. But yeah, I got a fancy new mic too, so we're all set to ready to go. It's Kindred Skulls going professional. So love to see it.
yeah, absolutely. Let's hope that we do not continue to have that problem. But I kind of steamrolled over your Aaron Rodgers joke there, Nick. So I apologize. I hope you haven't been consuming too much ghee recently. Ghee, is that how you say that? I don't
No,
really
no
know.
ghee, no organic enemas, nothing like that for me.
Yeah.
Just, it's a mental cleanse, not like a
Okay.
uh whatever
Okay.
Aaron
Good.
Rodgers.
We're just making sure you're not evacuating from both ends. Is I believe the
No,
phrasing.
no, not anytime current. I did run a marathon the other day for the first time, and I felt like evacuating at both ends by the end of it.
Well,
So
fair enough.
our listeners are getting way too much information about our personal lives right now. So they're like, "Oh man,
Yeah.
Kirk Cousins episode. This is great." Now here we are talking about
Yeah. So we
Aaron
talked
Rodgers
about Kirk
started it, so I
Cousins.
blame him.
We do want to swerve because a couple weeks ago we did a mailbag, and to break us up between the Kirk Cousins talk, give us at least something else we can talk about here. Uh, the one big football question that we didn't get to there from Eric Russell, at Cairo Eric. Why are the Vikings hiring a former GM in Ryan Grigson with a suspect draft record? He says, especially on the OL, instead of someone more innovative, like Catherine Reich is the example. And I guess for me, I'll take this first. For me personally, like I think bringing in somebody with GM experience makes sense. And one of the things I think that's interesting about the NFL is they don't really give too many GMs second chances at the job, right? And it's a little bit interesting to me because when you come into a new job, you don't know how everything works right away, right? You don't know how everything works from day one and how it's going to operate. And GM is kind of a unique role where you have to manage the football operations, like the entirety of the football operation. We talked about this in the Kwesi Adolfo Mensa hire, right? Where it's not just drafting players that you do as a GM, right? There's a lot of things that you have to do. You set schedules, you're basically responsible for hiring everybody in the football organization, and you have to listen to a whole bunch of opinions. So ideally as a GM you would learn over time, and even if you get fired from the role, if you want to maintain in football, you would take lessons that you learned from that and be able to improve upon them going forward and help out moving forward. Now I believe Quasey also has experience for like 1 year or something with Grigson. But I think having that experienced voice in a room for somebody who's a young general manager candidate can be a positive thing. Obviously, there definitely are concerns about specifically his OL evaluations, specifically how he chose to build those Colts teams around Andrew Luck, which is he did not do a very good job putting a supporting cast around him. But at the end of the day, I guess the hope would be that he's learned and grown from those experiences. I don't know if you have any thoughts on Grigson there.
Yeah, I mean, this is a guy with whom Kwesi already has a working relationship since Gregson was in a front office role with the Browns, and I think especially compared to Catherine Raish, who I heard was very impressive in her interview with the Vikings, but Grigson brings a very complementary skill set to Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, who, coming from his analytics background, is not your traditional football guy, tape muncher guy who, lives all day coming up this pro scouting or the college scouting route, working up the ranks that way. Grigson did, and that's kind of why he was hired, is he had a very keen eye for talent and built himself as a reputation as somebody really knew his stuff, really knew how to scout players at I think the Eagles before he came to Indianapolis. So Raish, I think, is a very interesting candidate. I thought it would have been very cool to bring her in as an assistant GM, but she's an attorney who kind of comes. Her specialty is with like the player management, the contract negotiation, that whole aspect. And we already have Rob Brzezinski, who's like one of the best in the business. So I'm not sure. Raish, I think, is great in a vacuum, but if you're looking at the value add to the Vikings, I'm not sure what she brings that we don't already get with Rob Brzezinski, who I think is one of the best at his job. Certainly in like the top tier of guys in terms of in-house extensions, contract negotiations, managing the salary cap. So, whereas Grigson, I think, specifically does bring something that Kwesi Adofo-Mensah doesn't have. I mean, we do have Jamal Stevenson, we do have Ryan Monin, so we do have a whole scouting infrastructure here, but I think Grigson brings one more person with whom Kwesi already has a working relationship, and that Kwesi can lean on for player evaluation decisions. It's just one more voice in the room, and I think it's easy to look at any GM or any head coach and see how they failed and think like, well, this guy brings negative value to an organization. But the fact that a guy flamed out at a very top role doesn't mean that they're bad at their job. In fact, it usually means they're good enough to get hired to the top, and it just didn't work out in their previous stops. So like a lot of these head coaches that have worked with the Vikings, former head coaches who came in and worked under Mike Zimmer ended up adding a lot of value. Tony Sperano or Pat Shermer or Gary
Kubiak.
Kubiak, a lot of those guys. So and it's the same. It's the same idea with bringing in former GMs. Just having more experience, especially one who pairs up very well with Kwesi, given their relationship. Kwesi, kind of spoke to their personal friendship a little bit and why they're bringing. He said Grigson's got a great sense of humor and good eye for talent. So I think that's going to help Kwesi, I think, learn to transition into making decisions and building consensus around player management and player evaluation as well. So I do think that fits in with, in a vacuum, I like Raish, but for what the Vikings need, I think Grigson is a good ad.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the complementary skill sets that you hit on there, where Grigson comes from the scouting side and the pro scouting side, and Kwesi is more of a, the quote unquote analytics guy. And if you have Raish added into that equation, she comes from the more analytics business side as well. Right. So you're kind of, if you bring in Raish, you're kind of doubling down on skill sets a little bit. That's not to say that she's not qualified for an assistant GM. She probably very much is based on what we've heard about her, but it's just not totally clear. Um, so now that we got a little palate cleanser here, right before our Kirk discussion, why don't we roll into the Kirk Cousins discussion? This is something that we got questions about in the mailbag, and we decided, there's too much meat on the bones here for us to go with it. As part of the episode, it's kind of something we need to bring out and do our own episode on, because that's really the biggest decision facing the Vikings this offseason is what to do with Kirk Cousins, right? We're a significant amount over the cap, and the two options we have in terms of contracts to get us under the cap are Danielle Hunter and Kirk Cousins, right? And Kirk can save us a lot more money than Danielle can. I mean, Danielle saves a significant amount of money too, but Kirk, if you get his contract off the books by trading him, saves $35 million for the Vikings against the cap this season. So it's a huge decision that the Vikings' new decision makers and Kevin O'Connell and Kwesi Adofo-Mensah will need to come to an agreement on, right? So it bears a lot of discussion. We're 3 weeks out really from the start of free agency. We're 3 weeks out from when they need to make a decision for what the heck to do with Kirk, because you can't go into the new year over the salary cap, right? So it's something that's coming really close here. And I guess just the way we have this set up, we're going to start out with the positives. So let's go, Nick. What's Kirk good at? Is the first question we have.
Yeah, he's good at a lot of things. He's probably, with the retirement of Brady and Drew Brees, dare I say, the prototypical pocket passer in the NFL today. A lot of the things that he does really well kind of comport with the Peyton Manning prototype, or Tom Brady, Drew Brees, Philip Rivers, that kind of style of quarterback. So starting with just he's a very accurate thrower of a football. He's consistently charted and statistically ranked as one of the most accurate quarterbacks in the NFL. That's true of like his basic, completion percentage statistics, which is always amongst the highest in the NFL. It's also true though of, his advanced accuracy statistics. Next Gen Stats has a accuracy metric called completion percentage above expectation, which takes into account, okay, how accurate are you throwing the football, but also what's your completion percentage when you take into account how open what the receiver was? How far away are they from the sideline? How far away are they from the nearest defender? Because throwing, 30 yards downfield right on the sideline with a guy draped all over him is a lot different from throwing, a check down to CJ Ham wide open in the flat. So it takes all those things into account and compares it to the NFL baseline for what would be expected, and it also takes into account how far they are downfield. So all the most important factors into not just how well do they complete their passes, but what does that look like when you can adjust for the difficulty of the passes they're throwing to. Kirk Cousins has ranked in the top 4 of that metric each of the last 4 years. So just a very consistently accurate thrower of the football. Pro Football Focus does separately charts every single target based on, does it hit their chest plate? Is it behind them? Is it in front of them? Does the receiver have to catch it at their helmet? Do they have to high point it above it their helmet? Is it uncatchable, or is it catchable but inaccurate? Kirk Cousins ranked in the top 4 this past season as well. So just a very elite, accurate thrower of the football. I think it's him, Russell Wilson, probably Joe Burrow. There's probably a couple other guys. Brady would have been in that tier as well, but now that he's retired, so I think he's a very accurate thrower of the football. And I think in keeping with that pocket passer prototype, he's a very elite processor. He reads the field very, very well, both pre-snap and post-snap. He's able to diagnose coverage as well, and he knows how to take care of the football. And moreover, he's very good at getting through his reads quickly. Like, he'll regularly throw passes to the fourth read in plays, and that's not a skill that you can expect most quarterbacks coming out of college to be able to do. There aren't very many quarterbacks who can read the field, and that opens up opportunities for his receivers because he gets through his options very quickly. His mechanics are very pristine in the pocket. He's got very good footwork. That's part of what leads to his good accuracy. It helps his offensive line as well. He's just very consistent with his footwork. It's part of how they can run an under center offense with him. He's a very good decision maker with the football, particularly when it comes to avoiding turnovers. He doesn't throw very many turnovers. He doesn't throw many interceptions. He has historically had a bit of a strip sack problem, but I think he's gotten better in recent years. In fact, I would go so far as to say his pocket presence is pretty darn good right now. He's not. Well, we'll get into the negatives a little bit, but he's very good at avoiding negative plays. So kind of everything you want in sort of the prototypical West Coast pocket passer. He's got teach tape mechanics in terms of his footwork, and a lot of his delivery is very clean. It's not like an elite release, and he can't switch up the arm angles the way that some of these younger, more athletic quarterbacks can. But just the accuracy is elite. The decision making, and especially in terms, if we think of decision making as far as avoiding mistakes, is elite. And he's, the accuracy, decision making, and the processing, I think, are all. I would put Kirk Cousins up there with anyone in the NFL. So those are the 3 ones I would identify as strongest as his biggest strengths. I don't know, Matt, if you disagree or would push back on any of that.
So I think generally you're pretty right. You're pretty correct there, right? Like, I'm pretty much in agreement with that. On the accuracy point, like, he is very accurate, when he has everything going well for him, right? If it's a clean pocket and he has, he just has his normal time, he's very accurate. He's also not inaccurate on the move, like particularly on rollouts or that sort of design thing. Like, he's still really accurate. He's one of the better quarterbacks actually moving to his left. and throwing the ball in that area. So
Yeah.
I would say
And it's easy
very,
to take that for granted. Like that,
yeah,
he makes those like boots to the left like look very easy. Those are not easy throws to make.
yeah.
So, and you don't think of Kirk as like the athletic quarterback who can like make the, but he's, I mean, we've seen it with Stefanski and Kubiak, like just how good he is at nailing
Yeah.
those deep rollouts.
And
So,
and this is a little bit into the bad side, but when he is harassed and forced to move around a little bit, as opposed to it being a designed rollout, I think it does break down in terms of the accuracy. Like he has very good arm strength for an NFL quarterback, right? It's not the top tier elite arm strength that you see somebody have. Like Patrick Mahomes has ridiculous arm talent, right? Josh Allen has ridiculous arm talent. Matthew Stafford has ridiculous arm talent, right? Just in terms of they can put the football wherever they want usually. That doesn't mean they're as pinpoint accurate as Kirk is, right? And Kirk can make all of the throws everywhere on the field. It's just maybe he's lacking a little bit of that arm power that the top tier guys have, right? So he's still very good in that. The pre-snap processing, I absolutely agree with you. Like pre-snap, if he gets what he expects, post-snap, he can dice the opponents up because he has an understanding of where he's going to go with the football, and he makes decisions based off of that. I think an example of this is like last year we seemed to love the one-on-one matchups to the outside where we would throw vertical routes like consistently, right? And he'd throw them to anyone. But we won on those a lot. Like CJ Ham caught a deep pass because they ran a one-on-one vertical route. Tyler Conklin caught a deep pass because they ran it and Kirk was willing to throw that. Like he's willing to take those risks pre-snap. Post-snap, I would say that he is generally very good, but it does get dicey when teams kind of change the picture or whatever. He goes through his reads very quickly though. On the one hand, like it's not like he's not seeing the field. Um and then at the end of the day, yeah, pocket mechanics, footwork, obviously, and maybe we'll just roll this over into some of the negatives, right? Like his pocket mechanics, as he's moving around, he's not going to escape, an Aaron Donald or somebody like that who gets on him in the pocket, who beats a passer. But he is able to climb the pocket. He's able to maneuver, use his offensive line to make that work. And especially the timing we saw this past year. I mean, he saved the offensive line so many times just from getting sacks early in the season in particular on short drops, making sure he's very precise footwork, not getting too deep in his drops, which is a problem particularly in quick game. And I think the Panthers game really highlighted it. I think that was Darrisaw's first start, and there were a number of plays where his precise footwork and not getting too deep in the pocket really helped Darrisaw, who got kind of beat on the edge a couple times if you have a quarterback who drifts deeper in the pocket in those instances, right? So I guess I kind of hit a couple of caveats to what I wanted to say are good, but in general, you are getting, like you said, Nick, that prototypical pocket style quarterback, right? You're getting a drop back passer who's incredibly accurate, who goes through his reads properly, and like you said, generally avoids mistakes. Like I think if you have a very good defense, this is a guy who you want on your team. On the flip side, in terms of the bad, like I mean it's just the problem with Kirk is he becomes mechanical, and he really seems to be mechanical. I think in a lot of respects, like we do see him using his legs and him kind of creating outside of the pocket in some instances, and I think in the past 2 seasons that's kind of ticked up a little bit. But at the end of the day, the way he goes through his decision making processes, he takes the risk averse option and he takes the option, and he's not able to think outside of the box on those decision making processes. And I think that's where the rub lies with Kirk as a quarterback, right? You will see him take the check down to CJ Ham in the flat 10 times out of 10 if that's where his read structure takes him, right? He's going to take that check down. He's not going to be pushing the ball outside of the design of the play call. That's not to say he's not willing to throw the ball deep. That's saying you need to bake that into his decision-making process in the play call for him to be willing to do so. He's not going to look at one-on-one opportunities when another corner has just come in, a backup cornerback has just come in the game and got put on Justin Jefferson because their starter got hurt, and he's not going to hit Justin Jefferson over and over and over again like Aaron Rodgers would just do with Devontae Adams, where when you get Chris Boyd in the game, guess what? Devontae Adams is getting targeted every single time with a guy on Chris Boyd is getting targeted every single time until you do something to give him help, right? So I think, and Tom Brady will do that relentlessly, right? Tom Brady at his best would do that relentlessly in terms of he's just going to target your weakest link on the field. And I think that that is where the rub is with Kirk Cousins, where he's not, this great creator outside of the pocket, right? He's just not athletic like some of the stars in the NFL are, and he just doesn't have the I don't even know if chemistry is the right word here, but the Vikings as a team haven't seemed to have the second chance on the route creation ability. And I think part of that's Kirk moving around. Part of that's maybe, how Aaron Rodgers always seems so synced up with his wide receivers when he breaks the pocket and they break in the same direction. That hasn't been consistently there for the Vikings. I think part of that is Kirk's willingness to check down before bailing from the pocket, right? Which, again, is not necessarily a bad thing. Like, I think it makes sense. It's just hard when you're not consistently getting massive gains on checkdowns, right? Like, if you're getting a 2-yard gain with CJ Ham on a checkdown and on 2nd and 10, and now it's 3rd and 8, like, I'm not quite sure how much that helps you in reality, right? So the creation ability, you did mention the strip sacks with the fumbles. It does seem like, in critical situations, and this isn't always the case, and that's kind of somewhat of the frustrating part with Kirk, is you see flashes of like where this works very nicely, right? And last year we had a number of comebacks where it kind of worked very nicely. But like his willingness to take checkdowns, to take throws in the middle of the field in 2-minute drill situations gets really frustrating because it ends up burning clock and ends up hurting the team, right? And I mean, we can talk about some of the positive game-winning drives that Kirk has had, and he's certainly had those. But you also have to look at how many drives have ended in an interception or like all of a sudden it's 3rd and 10 or 4th and 10, like immediately, right, on a 2-minute drill drive. And I think that his success rate on those, I don't have it up, but in Arif's article, Arif wrote a very long article in terms of Kirk Cousins' decision-making and mentality. That's Arif Hassan, obviously. Kirk is actually well below average in terms of those numbers of chances on those drives that he's converted. So I guess the main thing is creation ability outside of the structure of the play, right? That's like the key to Kirk in terms of what goes wrong with him.
Yeah, and I think that's a really comprehensive answer. If I could just tease out, I think the main drawback with Kirk is there's no creativity. But I think there's a lot of different underlying reasons why that is. I think
I think it might be intentional that there's no creativity, but that's maybe part of the problem. Like.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is just his makeup as who he is as a quarterback. I think one, he's a pocket passer. So when you compare him to Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson or Patrick Mahomes or Justin Herbert, he just doesn't have those same physical tools that those guys have. He's got an NFL caliber arm. He can make all the throws on the field. But when we talk about arm talent, a lot of times what we're talking about is not just how much power are you able to put there, or are you able to put sufficient touch on it, which Cousins has sufficient power. I would probably put him below average among NFL starters just because like every year there's like 5 new guys.
It seems like so many guys have like bazookas now, yeah.
Like Kirk is good. He's got a better arm than Joe Burrow. He's got a probably, it's like in the Tannehill realm. It's like good. It's like, you're not going to take anything out of the playbook because of his arm limitations. It's better than Teddy Bridgewater's. But it's not going to unlock, specific things. Windows are going to be tighter in the red zone because you got to really fire those balls out because it's such tight windows. So, but not just the miles per hour or the RPMs on the football or the touch, but also the ability to change up the arm angles in the slots. And this is something that Stafford gets a lot of credit for. This is something Mahomes in particular does an outstanding job at. And Cousins is great when he has a clean platform and is able to really use all his full body clean, teach tape mechanics for, to step into his throws and throw an accurate football follow through. But, when he's got guys draped around his feet, he's not able to, he needs the lower half of his body to be able to drive the football down the field. He's not able to make these Mahomes throws where he's midair or he's got a guy tackling his feet or whatever. So that's part of the reason Cousins can't be creative is because like physically, he's got one way of throwing the football. And if there's pressure around him, he's not able to change the arm angles that a lot of guys are. So that's part of the problem. I think part of the problem is just like stylistically, he likes to follow the play call as followed, and he doesn't sort of when I compare him to like the great pocket passing, I said he's a quarterback in the style of Peyton Manning. When you compare him though to Peyton Manning had a lot more, and Philip Rivers too had a lot more control over the offense and ability to dictate where the football was going. Cousins kind of like he follows orders. He doesn't like make plays. He doesn't call audibles on the field. Part of that is offensive design, and it's not necessarily Cousins' job to be his own OC, but part of that I think is just Cousins kind of just like does what the OC tells him to do, regardless of whether he thinks it's a good idea or not. And that's something that kind of separates, Peyton Manning. I think the other thing that, I mean, there's a lot of things that separate him and Peyton Manning and Tom Brady, but two of the other ones, because yeah, they were those Kirk Cousins, like Tom Brady and Peyton Manning, is an elite pocket passer or is an elite thrower of the football with elite accuracy and great decision making and great processing. I think Brady and Manning were a lot better at generating positives. Kirk is kind of like he'll do what the offensive coordinator tells him to do, but he doesn't generate his own positives like of his own accord. Like he doesn't freestyle. He doesn't do backyard football. He does. I mean, we saw a little bit of it from him this past year. He's clearly tried to work on it a little bit.
Yeah.
But he's not able to create his own positive throws down.
It's hard for him. Like it's obvious that he's trying to do it. You know what I mean? Where for other guys, it just seems to come naturally as part of how they play. Like it is obvious that it's the problem is it's something it seems like he has to think about, right? As opposed to being able to just do it.
Yeah, it's kind of like Jimmy Garoppolo in a way. Like Jimmy Garoppolo is like a good thrower of the football in a lot of ways. Cousins does a lot better job than Jimmy G. Like Cousins' brain doesn't melt down when he's held onto the ball for more than 3 seconds the way that Jimmy G's does. So and Jimmy G's like a good quarterback and a lot of he's got a lot of similar strengths as Kirk Cousins, but I think they both struggle with they're not going to be quarterbacks who make their own magic. They're not going to be, I've seen this comparison. I think it works a lot in basketball. Guys who can create their own shots. When the shot clock is down to zero, guys who can just take a pull up mid range jumper when they need to and be able to make those balls go in. Like that's not Cousins' game. So Cousins needs to have things like schemed up for him a little bit. So. And part of that is because, he's not an athlete. He's not compared to some of the quarterbacks coming out. He's not an athlete. He doesn't have the arm angles, the arm talent, and he's more of a conservative quarterback. Obviously, you can go back to the stories of Jay Gruden calling him out and saying like Cousins doesn't want to throw these balls and Kirk saying well, I don't want to throw 20 interceptions, and Jay Gruden saying, well, if you started throwing these, you'd throw 60 touchdowns and you wouldn't have to worry about the 20 interceptions. So that's a little bit of like Cousins' makeup. He's a little bit more risk averse. He will decline open receivers that he feels aren't quite open enough. So all these things combine to a quarterback who does a good job avoiding mistakes, which is a huge thing. Like it's easy to take that for granted. Like if Jameis Winston or Brett Favre were our quarterback, like we would not take for granted how hard it is to have a quarterback who gives the ball over or makes mistakes. But at the same time, though, it makes him extremely reliant on having a good offensive coordinator, a good schemer, a good play caller. I think this is why Kyle Shanahan and Sean McVay are in love with him in the way that the rest of the NFL isn't, because he's a robot who can follow orders really well and can execute phenomenally well, better than almost any quarterback in the NFL. But he will just execute the directions and won't add his own pizzazz. And sometimes that's enough. But it's really, you need a Kyle Shanahan or a Sean McVay, because otherwise, most offensive coordinators are not as good as those guys and need a quarterback who can make some magic happen. Pull a Deshaun Watson and, instead of getting sacked, roll out and find a guy downfield. Cousins, that's not Cousins. When Cousins is under pressure, he was 34th, I think, in yards per attempt under pressure. He doesn't make mistakes under pressure. He had the 5th best sack avoidance rate when under pressure, and the 2nd best interception rate when under pressure.
It's just I'm under pressure, I check the ball down. That's his answer for pressure. Which when teams figure that out and they have a guy on the check down, you end up 34th in yards per attempt under pressure, right? Like that's.
Yeah. And we saw that this year. Like this, I think it was the Browns who game planned around this. Like if we just blitz Kirk and we just keep him under heavy pressure, He'll continue to throw the ball really short, just around the
Yep.
stick or around the line of scrimmage, and the offense will be completely neutered. And it was. We scored 7 points that game, and so that's kind of the problem with Kirk Cousins is, you need pass protection, you need an offensive coordinator. He does legitimately elevate some of these players, like in how pristine his footwork is and how good he is at reading the field and getting rid of the ball quickly. He does elevate his offensive line. Like, it's easy to take that for granted. And by what a good like throw over the football he is, especially like deep, is what an accurate throw over the football, and how he's so good processing the field that he will get to reads faster that, like, Kellen Mond certainly would be able to on the field. He doesn't leave a lot of those kinds of plays on the field because he's just slow getting through his reads. So he does elevate these players, but at the same time, like, if he's under a lot of pressure, if he doesn't have a good offensive coordinator, he kind of I kind of hate this trope, but he does need a lot of things to go right. And if he does, he's like a very, very elite quarterback. But if he's not, he's just kind of like a good quarterback. And that's kind of the problem with Kirk Cousins is he's good, sure, but is good enough? So
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, and to pull out a couple things you talked about, I'm glad the way you described his mechanics earlier, because that's what I was trying to get to with his off plat. Like, when he's throwing the ball under pressure, like directly under duress, it's different from when he's throwing the ball running to his left, right? Like, he can use his lower body and he can make those throws running to his left. So on the run in that instance is different from on the run when you have a guy draped around your legs or something like that. And like you mentioned, he's not able to change the arm angles, which, like, it seems like every quarterback coming in the NFL is able to do now, or at least, and the best quarterbacks in the NFL that we talk about are tend to be really good about that, right? So that's a good one. The other one I wanted to point out is, what we were talking about just now, I think is part of the reason why Kirk was like one of the highest graded PFF QBs this past year, right? Like, and I believe in the annual or whatever, he was graded first in a clean pocket, and I think 17th or something like that outside of a clean pocket. And
yep.
the 17th thing, we talked about his struggles under pressure. Like, that's relatively obvious, I think, to everybody watching, that he's not the best when he has people in his face pressuring him, right? Like, I don't think that's a controversial statement. I think, like what you were talking about with the comparison to Peyton Manning and Tom Brady, though, is why him being first in a clean pocket is not necessarily the boon that it can be made out to be as being number one in the clean pocket. He is going to process everything per the book and as the play is called. He is not going to make the modifications at the line of scrimmage to change a play, to exploit something that's in the defense, and you're going to get what your offensive play caller is able to call for you on that play. But when he's making those decisions to go through his reads really quickly and take a short check down, that's not going to be a negatively graded play, because PFF doesn't grade really the mental process, right? They grade, did you put the ball in danger, and did you throw the ball accurately, right? So they're not taking a look at saying what a quarterback could have theoretically done on this play. They are taking a look at what the quarterback was asked to do on the given play and what they executed on that play. And obviously, like we talked about, that is Kirk's exact strength. That's why he grades out as number one there. The problem becomes when you ask him to expand beyond what the play caller called for him, because you're asking him to exploit a mismatch on the field that other quarterbacks are willing to do, right? If the Rams at the end of that Super Bowl, decide not to go to Cooper Kupp on every single play, if Matthew Stafford is like, well, they're triple teaming Cooper Kupp, maybe I shouldn't go to him on every single play. Maybe Kirk doesn't do that, right? Maybe he takes his lesser options, and that hurt the Rams quite a bit in that game. So that's, I think, where the difference with Kirk kind of sits in, as opposed to the players who are creators.
It's like that episode of The Office where Michael Scott drives the car into the lake because that's where the GPS tells him to go. Like, yes. Kirk Cousins, it's like third down. You know what? I'm going to throw it up to my wide receiver 4 on a fade on 3rd and 3 because, like, man, this is what the reads tell me to do, so I'm doing it. Dang it! So
no, exactly. And Kirk and like Peyton Manning was the GPS. Right, Kirk follows the GPS. Peyton Manning was the GPS, and that's the difference in that analogy.
I hate to knock the guy for intangibles or leadership or charisma. Or
it's
things
really
like
hard
that.
to know without being in the building. We'll preface it with that.
Yeah.
But.
And so it's hard to have a strong take on that, but it just feels like guys don't rally around Kirk Cousins the way that you see them rally around other quarterbacks in the NFL. And he's not assertive. And this kind of gets into why he's different from Peyton Manning or Philip Rivers at the line of scrimmage. He just kind of, to his credit, he'll kill plays. He'll kill into a run play, or when we have call package plays, you can see him do that. Clearly, he makes a lot of like pre-snap reads and calls them out and communicates them to the offense. So he's not like a complete robot just doing everything. But at the same time, like you go back and watch some Peyton Manning film and like just see just how much Peyton Manning is like orchestrating that entire thing, and then go look at Kirk Cousins, what he's doing on the field, and that I think is true both of his on the field pre-snap command of the offense, but also like you expect your quarterback to be like the CEO of the team, or like it's almost like we use the term quarterback to mean somebody who's like the communicator, like in general society or in business. Like you're the quarterback, you're going to be leading this team, you're going to be communicating with everybody, you're going to be the point person that everybody relies to, turns to, and that's just kind of like you don't get that vibe necessarily from Kirk Cousins. And granted, we're fans, we don't have that access, we can't judge it, but like even just compared to Teddy, like the way Coach Zimmer talked about like Teddy compared to the way his relationship with Kirk Cousins, it's just a very different vibe. So obviously the most important thing is how you play on the football field, but the intangibles are part of it too. And I don't think you could complete your analysis of Kirk Cousins without talking about that aspect of it as well. So
yeah, no, I agree. It's interesting. Like, and part of this is probably a good thing, right? You don't want your football player to get overworked when it's a pressure situation, right? You don't want him to get too worked up and then he starts doing wild things and making mistakes. But at the same time, you like to see like the competitive fire, right? Like, where's Kirk begging to go for it on fourth down in critical situations in the game, right? You see the best quarterbacks in the NFL, like they're not leaving the field. Like if it's Peyton Manning and it's a critical fourth down and he needs to do it, he's standing on that field, right, until it's there. I mean, you can talk about how many times you see Patrick Mahomes or Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen do that where they're waving guys off or whatever, or they're getting asked directly, hey, should we go for it on the fourth down? Kirk's not that kind of assertive player, and from a leadership perspective, I think that matters from the quarterback position. Like, I don't know how much it matters. I'm not a professional football player, right? I don't get paid to play football, so I find it hard to really knock a guy too hard. But whatever that fiery leadership aspect that gives guys an extra bump above their playing ability is, I don't think Kirk has that, at least. I don't think that means that guys on the team hate him and they don't want to play with him or for him, but I just don't think he adds anything to the team in that respect. And that's something that maybe you would want your quarterback to do in an ideal world, right? Like, I think you want your quarterback to do that. So,
yeah. You just look at his relationship with his wide receiver. Justin Jefferson talks about Kirk Cousins in a different way than he talks about Joe Burrow as college quarterback. It's just a different vibe, and it's it may be coincidental, but I'm not sure it entirely was that like Stephon Diggs tweeting out that it's time for a new beginning happened literally hours after the Kirk Cousins extension became public. So.
It's not like you would have to work very hard to convince me that was not that was coincidental. Like, you would have to work very hard to convince me that that's coincidental. And of course, like, he and Jefferson and Diggs were all buddy at the Pro Bowl, but like, they're just going to be friends having a good time. Like, just because you don't like certain aspects about a person doesn't mean you don't like them as a person, right? Like,
yeah, and it's like this feels like I'm personally attacking. I think Kirk is a good dude. He's like he does a lot of charity work. He seems like a normal guy. In a lot of ways, like if I were an NFL quarterback, I feel like I would be very Kirkian in a lot of ways.
Sure.
Like a little awkward and not entirely sure. But like you want your quarterback to be, your type A alpha dog, and that's not always Kirk's personality. So and when he tries to be that personality, it always feels a little funny. Like his fired up pregame speeches, his you like that outbursts. So. I don't know.
Yeah, he's more of a choir boy, right? Like, he feels like a choir boy as a quarterback, which is not it's not bad to be that. It just maybe isn't the best for the quarterback role.
Yeah, we're harping a lot about his drawbacks, and I think that's good. I think what he's good at is already really well established, so it probably makes a little bit more sense to tease out like That's really the Kirk Cousins conundrum is like he puts up these ungodly top five stats that make him look like he's peers with Brady and Peyton Manning, and in a lot of ways, stylistically, he has a lot of the same traits that Tom Brady and Peyton Manning is. So the real question is, okay, well, why do those guys win so much while Kirk Cousins is perpetually a 500 quarterback? And I think a lot of these questions that we're getting at, these limitations he has in his game that even Mahomes certainly doesn't, and even the pocket passers, the elite pocket passers didn't, kind of explains it. And getting into comparing him to other quarterbacks, I think that leads to our next
Yeah.
point, which is with all this combined, where would you rank Kirk Cousins among the other quarterbacks? I think that's a big point of discussion. Is obviously the Mahomes are better, and obviously he's better than I don't know your
Yeah.
Justin Fields or
So
whoever.
so do you have any numbers for us, Nick, or you want I can pull up some numbers here on Kirk quick. If we want to, just to kind of give it a palette, right? Because we did talk about some of the negatives here, but I think it makes sense to at least go over, where he ranks among quarterbacks just from like a numbers perspective, right? And then where we think he ranks in terms of actually physically ranking the quarterback, just to give some kind of a. Sorry, give me a second here. All right, so passing numbers, right? Kirk, and I use a couple different things. I don't have EPA for per play up, but he was actually 10th in yards per attempt this past year. And if you look at adjusted net yards per attempt, which incorporates, he was actually fourth. Wow, I didn't even realize that. So adjusted net yards per attempt gives a bonus per touchdown, gives a negative per interception that you throw, and it also takes into account sacks. So he was fourth in the NFL in ANYA behind Aaron Rodgers, Joe Burrow, and Matthew Stafford this past year. So that's really good, and obviously that shows through in he had 33 touchdowns to 7 interceptions, right? That helps him quite a bit because a lot of guys threw, actually it was pretty high for the number of interceptions players were throwing this year. I think it was a higher rate. And he took very few sacks on the year with only taking 28 sacks. So that's where it kind of leads in terms of adjusted net yards per attempt and statistically, right? And you look at EPA for play, he's up there. The Vikings offense as a whole wasn't that great just in terms of as an offense this past year, right? We were 16th in DVOA on offense, I believe. So the offense maybe a little bit less than Kirk's overall performance just from where he compares to other passers. But so I wanted to give the numbers for context, right?
Yeah.
With that, the problem with the numbers is what lies beyond the numbers, right? And we took a lot of time explaining that. So if I'm ranking Kirk, I have quite a few guys that I'm putting over him in the NFL currently. Russell Wilson's. Let's start with the obvious guys, right? Like I don't think there should be a dispute about Russell Wilson, Aaron Rodgers, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes. For me, Lamar Jackson. I don't know how you feel about Lamar, but
I put Lamar over him.
yeah. And then
Although I would say, I think interestingly, we could talk about this. I think you can debate Russ.
Okay, I think that the Russ may be some pass bias for me, but yeah, he might be on the fringe there. Joe Burrow, I definitely put over him. And then if you get into questions, we can bring Russ back to a question. So it would be 6 guys you're definitively putting over him without really much of a question at all. Matthew Stafford, I'd put over him. I think the performance this entire season and winning the Super Bowl catapults Matthew Stafford over him. I know I haven't ever been the biggest Matthew Stafford guy, but like he did it, guys. Like I don't know what else to say there. And I'm not entirely sure Kirk in that situation does that, so that's where I'm at. Kyler is an interesting one. I would have Kyler over him, especially how he is going to play moving forward, I feel. And then, so that was 9, I believe. And then sorry, here, give me a minute.
Dak yet?
Oh, Dak as well. Dak as well, I would put over him. So, those are the guys I would put over Kirk. I think that puts him at 11th. I think you could also have discussions about, and this for me would be the question. You are paying one quarterback the exact same amount of money, right? So put all of these guys on the level playing field. Don't consider their contracts. Who are you taking, Kirk or this player? So those 10 guys, it would be Lamar, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes. Oh, Justin Herbert. Also unquestionably above Kirk to me. Uh, Russell Wilson, Matthew Stafford, Kyler Murray, Aaron Rodgers, and then finally Joe Burrow and Dak Prescott.
How would you compare Kirk to? I have my own list. So see, these are
Yeah.
some of the guys who come. How would you compare Kirk to Tannehill, who kind of fits in the
I
similar sort of offense
I
and has
think
similar limitations?
Kirk is, if you want to go that level of quarterback, I think you could have a discussion about Derek Carr and Ryan Tannehill over Kirk, but I would put Kirk over them for the time being. When you factor money into it, I put both of them over Kirk based on their current contracts, for what it's worth.
Because of what?
With their current contract situations. I think they're very
No, I
close.
mean like traits-wise. Like, what do you think Kirk does better than Carr and Tannehill? I'm kind of curious because they're very similar quarterbacks.
I think Kirk's process is more consistent and better. Like we talked about how consistent he is. We talked about how he might be the most consistent quarterback in the NFL. I think that he is more consistent than them as players, and like Derek Carr maybe gives you a little bit of aggression upside compared to Kirk. Ryan Tannehill, I think, is mostly downside compared to Kirk. He has more athleticism. Well, they both have more athleticism than Kirk does. But I would say that Kirk's overall process is better, and the athleticism upside that they give you does not overcome like the decision making and throwing of the football that Kirk does.
Yeah, yeah. The only other guy that I think would have an argument over Kirk, but he's on the downswing is Matt Ryan. Where would you put him in that?
So, and my thing with Matt Ryan would be, if you take the majority of if you take Matt Ryan's career, I'm unquestionably taking Matt Ryan's career over Kirk. If you take Matt Ryan 2 years ago, I'd probably take Matt Ryan 2 years ago over Kirk now. I think he's physically declined to the point based on this last season, and it's a hard comparison because Atlanta's receivers were awful, like awful last year out after Calvin Ridley, was out for the rest of the season. Kyle Pitts obviously extremely talented, but you cannot have like street level wide receivers and only Kyle Pitts and make a significant passing offense. I just think his arm has deteriorated to the point where I wouldn't put him over Kirk, but he is in the discussion as well for me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I've got my list, and Kirk does wind up in the top 10 as a spoiler alert, but my list would be Mahomes 1, Rodgers 2, Allen 3, Herbert 4, Burrow 5. I feel like right now that's the kind of the consensus elite tier. And I do think Burrow belongs. I think there's been some pushback at elevating Burrow just because like, oh, the recency bias with the Super Bowl run, but like no, like Burrow, we talk about Kirk as like an elite accurate processor. Like that's really Joe Burrow's game. Is like Joe Burrow now. I think it is with Brady's retirement, it sets the bar for an elite accurate pocket passer who gets through his reads exceptionally quickly and is also able to navigate a muddy pocket very well.
I think what Burrow adds too is that off script improvisational skill where he's not like a great athlete or whatever, but he has an understanding of how everything is going to move around him and is able to make that work. I mean, he's done that since LSU, right? If you watch him at LSU against Alabama, like he's doing stuff on the run all the time. If you watch him in the AFC Championship game, like he won that game with his legs almost on a couple of those plays where he was able to get out. So, yep, totally agree.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think Burrow's more accurate than each of the four guys above him, but I just feel those four guys have those four guys: Mahomes, Rodgers, Allen, Herbert, top 5 arms. Burrow probably has a bottom 5 arm.
He's just starters. Not as physically talented. Yep.
Yeah, so that's probably why I put him 6. I would probably put Lamar, but Lamar is such an interesting one because, like, if you have money aside, I would not swap Kirk next year for Lamar next year, and that's just because like Lamar needs. It is his own like style of off, and the Ravens do a phenomenal job building around what he does well, and his tools are out of this world. Like Lamar he gets underrated for a guy who like won MVP once and twice every time. So I mean he's an exceptionally talented quarterback. So I would put him there, but like I don't know people, and he was coming off a rough year because Baltimore was devastated by injuries more than almost.
And he was hurt too. I mean he missed the last 6 games or what.
Yeah, but like if we're comparing in a vacuum, I would put Lamar above Kirk, even though Like, I think for the offense that we want to do, like this McVay stuff, I think Kirk is better for a McVay offense than Lamar, obviously. And if we had Lamar, obviously we would want to find our own Greg Roman or something. You could make it work, but
Yep.
yeah, Lamar's interesting. I would put Dak above Kirk, but they're very similar quarterbacks to me in a lot of ways. Both guys, I think, get underrated because of their draft stock. Dak being a third rounder who people I think resisted anointing as this like top tier quarterback for a long time. Kirk the same way as a fourth rounder who like Washington fans never bought into him because like RG3 was always the guy, and then Kirk only came in because of injuries and then other controversies, and then they were never able to sign a long-term deal. And then Minnesota, he came to Minnesota, but like Teddy was the guy, so he's kind of been this mercenary like that nobody's ever really been willing to go to bat for. So I think they get underrated because of the draft stock carries them a little bit, but also, they're not toolsy, flashy quarterbacks. They're kind of they're surrounded by good receivers, and people tend to credit the receivers a lot more without realizing what the quarterbacks do for them. They're both very good processors, accurate. I mean, Dak obviously has more tools, I think, but not a ton more. So I don't know. I just feel like Dak gives you he's a little bit when we talk about command of the offense, I think Dak has a little bit more command in terms of like understanding his protections and where that sets things up. And I think he does have a little bit better of an arm. Well, actually, you could probably debate that, but I think like the arm angles and stuff, Dak
Yeah.
probably wins there. Um, Kirk probably a little bit more accurate. I could argue Kirk over Dak if I wanted to, but I think in a vacuum, they're a similar. I don't know if I'd say they're in a similar tier, but I'd say Dak probably above, but it's not a huge distance between him and Kirk.
Yeah, I would
Um,
agree with that overall assessment, and I think I would say that I also think that Dak has more room for growth given that he's a younger player. Not that that should matter in terms of like a competition right now, but I think he is at least at the level of Kirk, if not better than him right now. And what we're both ranking him above him, so I think we kind of agree in that landscape, right?
Yeah. And then the last guy I would have before Kirk is Russ. I would have Russell Wilson above Kirk. And the reason I think you can debate is because I think Russell Wilson, I mean, obviously one of the most accurate, probably the most accurate passer in the NFL. I would say I mean, Burrow maybe is up there, and you could make arguments for some of these other guys. But Russ just has this exceptional track record. And the tools that Russell Wilson has, I mean, he's not the same like spring chicken running around like he used to when he was young, but he's still an exceptionally athletic quarterback
Mm-hmm.
with a bazooka of an arm, and just extremely accurate. So he brings so many things. The reason I'm hesitant to like I think you could argue Kirk above him is I don't think Kirk Cousins limits your playbook at all with what he does. I don't think he has any misgivings. I do think there's something to Russell Wilson's height, to his reluctance to hit the middle of the field, his penchant to just like I'm going to keep throwing deep fades down the sideline to
Yep.
DK or Tyler Lockett. I do think there are limitations to Russell Wilson's game, and I will say this kind of sounds crazy, and it probably will strike people as a little nuts. But I think Kirk has significantly better pocket presence than Russell Wilson does. And it's funny because like you think of
Russ
Russell
holds
Wilson as
onto the ball too much so often.
Russ creates a lot of his own sacks, and it's an issue, and it's part of it is because Seattle got by without an offensive line so long, and so they relied on Russ to just sort of hold on to the ball and roll out of pressure, and but now it results in sacks and broken plays, and I think I just for me personally, like as a pretend scout, like I just value the ability to execute an offense really well, a lot. And Russ doesn't do that exceptionally well, and Kirk does. So
Yep.
that's why I think it's debatable. All that said, it's hard to look at what Russ has done in the league and his track record on top of elite accuracy, elite tools, elite arm, elite athletic ability, and have Kirk Cousins like just a very not any of those elite tools above him. So I would probably still stick with Russ above him. And Russ probably is also getting a little underrated just because of how things went sidewise in Seattle for the first time. It wouldn't surprise me if next year we look at this list and Russ is in like the top 5 again. So I don't know. That's kind of where I come out of it. And then so I would have Kirk above Murray, Stafford, Tannehill, Carr, Matt Ryan, and I think everybody else in the league, the Mac Joneses and the Baker Mayfields, I think are a little more obvious.
Yeah.
Murray, I think his arrow is pointing up, but he holds onto the ball too long. He doesn't protect the ball. He fumbles a lot. And I'm really excited. Like if you're asking me who I want for the next 5 years, I think it's Kyler with a bullet. But if you're asking me just about next year, I'd probably still going with Kirk.
Yeah, and the way that season ended for the Cardinals like leaves a sour taste in your mouth, right? Like outside of all of the like ridiculous stuff that their front office is trying to leak out about Kyler or whatever, like, he kind of fell apart down the stretch. And one of the things that's happened to him as a quarterback is he's gotten injured kind of in his years where he's running around and stuff. And once he's a little bit physically limited, I think he tries to press, and it leads to more mistakes and not as good of an offense performance. I also don't like view Cliff Kingsbury very highly in terms of how he's like structured
Yeah.
that offense. So I think I give Kyler a little bit more credit as part of why I'm putting him ahead of him.
Yeah, and it's also hard to rank guys like Jalen Hurts or even Lamar or Murray, like these
Yeah.
like elite, like not just athletes, but like read option court. Like you can do your running game with this
Mhm.
quarterback. It's hard to factor that into the analysis because it's just a very different kind of quarterback in
Yeah.
the NFL, and it's almost like more of a college style quarterback, just based on most of the NFL has been ever since Peyton Manning's been like West Coast pocket passers, and we've there's always been promises of the Mike Vicks taking over, but for the most part, we haven't really seen a lot of teams design their run game around what their quarterback can do in the run game. So um, it's hard to like rank Kyler Murray. So uh, I can certainly see him above Kirk Cousins. Me personally, I kind of value what Kirk does a little bit more.
Yep.
Stafford. Um, that's a hard one because he's in a lot of ways he's really good at a lot of things. Obviously, I think his arm he's the top three arm talent in the NFL, not just the arm strength, the ability to the velocity he puts on his throws. That put there up there with any probably Mahomes and Josh
Yep.
Allen are the other two. But the arm angles, his ability to manipulate safeties with his eyes, his vision, he's very good getting through his reads. He's got exceptional pocket presence, better than Kirk Cousins, and I think he gets underrated for that. He's not like an athlete. He's not like a super athlete. At the same time, he has a lot more brain farts on the field than Kirk Cousins does.
Yeah.
So it's when we talk about like avoiding bad plays, like Kirk Cousins is very, very good at that. Matt Stafford is average, below average, maybe even.
Probably below average. I mean, you just have to go back and watch our game against them, right, to look at very
Even in the
bad
Super Bowl,
Matthew Stafford.
like what, three or four interceptable passes. So
Yeah.
people tend to. He's one of those guys who the highlights are amazing and the lowlights are like, oh man, what are we doing with this guy? So obviously he's coming off a Super Bowl. So if people want to put him above Kirk Cousins, I'm not going to argue because like he's the one with the ring right now. But um, and it also depends on like what you value. Like I value your accuracy and your ability to like execute the play call really well and really efficiently as it's drawn up more than arm strength that I can drool over. But at the same time, though, I feel like, especially with college scouting, there was a time when we were like, oh no, well, we've learned our lesson from Jamarcus Russell or, what other, like,
Yep.
big RQB, Ryan Leaf, because the model is like Peyton Manning and Tom Brady. And now we're realizing, well, actually, the Josh Allens and the Patrick Mahomes, that's pretty valuable too. So I don't know. I kind of, I maybe I'm biased for the pocket passers over the toolsy guys, but so I'm not going to argue with somebody who puts Stafford first, but me personally, I value what Kirk brings to the table a
It's
little bit more.
it's kind of an interesting flip for me personally because I mean, I thought the Stafford trade made sense from like Jared Goff is obviously like not that good and he's an upgrade for you at quarterback and you're going all in or whatever. But I didn't love Stafford as a quarterback. And I think a lot of, my questions about him kind of shone through during the regular season. And then he ends up winning the Super Bowl anyway. So it's like how much like the difference for the Rams from a divisional round exit with Jared Goff to a Super Bowl victory was Matthew Stafford, right? Like that was the difference in their team. And I think the variance and the highs is what led them there, obviously. Like, so I guess that's what ended up making me rank Stafford over Kirk was the positive end of that variance, which I think is kind of an important part of what you're looking for in a quarterback. Kind of hit on the trade there a little bit.
Let me ask you a
Okay, go
question
ahead.
before we move on. Do you think, in terms of offensive efficiency, say EPA per play, swap Stafford in 2021 with Kirk Cousins, which offense do you think is better? 'Cause I think it's
I
Kirk.
think the Rams offense is better. Like I think that's not even a question that the Rams offense is
With Kirk
better.
Cousins, you mean, or Stafford?
Uh oh. Um
Like if McVay gets, if
Okay,
we
I
say
see what you're
McVay
saying.
was wondering about, like they were thinking about trading for Kirk Cousins. So who do you think executes the Rams McVay offense in 2021 better, Matthew Stafford or Kirk Cousins? And you can assume that they'll do different things. Like maybe the whole shotgun spread thing they did with Stafford is a little different with Kirk Cousins. But which do you think is the better offense?
I think if you're looking at the efficiency numbers, it's probably Kirk. If you're looking at the playoffs, um, I think it's Matthew Stafford. That's a
I
really
think
cop out answer, but
no, but I think I'd agree with you. Like you're
yeah,
right. Like that Stafford brings you. Kirk doesn't create his own shots. Matthew Stafford does,
yep,
and sometimes in the playoffs that makes all the difference. So
yep. And it's like, maybe the Rams should have actually lost if Jimmy Ward catches an interception in the NFC Championship game, like he should have, right? But Kirk's not throwing that ball, and Kirk's not getting the ball down the field in 40 seconds or whatever against. Now, I know he did it against the Lions, right? But that's the Lions. Like, Kirk's not taking the deep shot, getting the ball down the field in 40 seconds against the Lions. Like, that's not happening. Or no, against the Bucks, right? In the divisional round to win the game after
yeah.
Tom Brady.
Kirk probably isn't throwing 3 interceptions so that he needs to dig himself out of a last
Yeah,
second game winning drive.
yeah.
So
So
it's an interesting question.
it really is. It's an interesting conundrum. So I think that Stafford is the guy I would have right before him, and I can't really fight too much in terms of where the ranking is. But I think that's a pretty fair ranking. I think you had him 9, I had him like 11 or something like that. When you come out with all the guys, I think he's in that range. I don't think he's in the tier below range, right? But he's also not in the elite quarterback tier, right? We name the top 5, and then I think there's even a little bit of a gap between him and the guys above that, right? Where we talk about Lamar, maybe Dak,
And
yeah.
I'll also say Kirk is very close in my mind to Tannehill and Carr. Like I think
Yep.
we talked already a little bit about why we would rank those guys a little bit after Kirk, but they're all very similar. They're even similar kinds of quarterbacks in what their positives, negatives, pocket passers.
Yep.
So like Kirk is a lot closer to like Matt Ryan at 14 on my list than he is to Joe Burrow at number 5 on my list, even though he's like number 9. So you can kind of lose that thread a little bit, but like just because like the numbering makes it seem like it's not equal distance between 1 and 2 or between 9 and 10.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of tiers, like there's an elite tier. And then there's like the Kirk tier, and there's a lot of guys in the Kirk tier. So,
no, absolutely,
that's kind of
so. Why don't we pivot to the next question that we had? Right, we mentioned the Matthew Stafford for Jared Goff trade. Obviously, that's kind of like a landmark trade in the NFL. Just quarterback for quarterback is an interesting swap. They sent 2 first-round picks along with it. Last year you also saw a couple other quarterback trades in terms of Carson Wentz going for a second that upgraded to a first because he played enough games for the Colts. And then also I think there was a third round. So it was basically a first and a third for Carson Wentz, which is ridiculous if you think about it. A second for Sam Darnold, and then a 6th for Teddy Bridgewater was the Teddy Bridgewater deal, right? Where it's a team that does not want their starting quarterback, figured they had something better in Sam Darnold, which also a strange decision. But I do think that the pattern of trading for a Carson Wentz and a Sam Darnold is different than trading for a Kirk Cousins. Because the trade for a Carson Wentz or a Sam Darnold is this guy is super talented, I can fix him. The trade for Kirk Cousins is I know exactly what Kirk Cousins is. I don't know where that lands on the Matthew Stafford, Jared Goff scale in terms of trades. But for me, for the Vikings, let's kick it to you, Nick. What is the minimum you would accept in a trade for Kirk Cousins?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. It's an important one because a lot of times I think people kind of dig their heels in the sand a little bit and just sort of like dig themselves into a position where I'm pro Kirk or I'm anti Kirk and I'm trade Kirk no matter what or I'm keep Kirk no matter what. And we don't realize all these things depends so much on like what is the offer. Like everybody's a trade Kirk guy if you get a Herschel Walker package for him. Like even the biggest Kirk stands will take like 10 first rounders for Kirk Cousins. Sure, I mean you can't trade 10 first rounders, but if somebody offers like an offer you can't refuse, like yeah, a lot of us will trade Kirk for that. And if the offer is like extend Kirk Cousins for like a Tom Brady sweetheart deal, I think most people would say like, well, shoot, yeah, if like we're gonna get him for like $20 million a year, like yes, that's a huge bargain. Sign me up for that. So in terms of like what do we extend or what's the minimum offer, I think I think about it in two phases. I think one, what sort of draft capital or what, who's your replacement at quarterback?
Yep.
I don't think it's Kellen Mond. I think it's somebody like a Jameis Winston or a Marcus Mariota or somebody who was a backup this year, and probably gives you like, bottom 10 quarterback play, but maybe not terrible quarterback play. And that's just a very different kind of quarterback that sets a very different sort of, um, you're contending
Sets different
aspirations
expectations for the
a
team.
lot. Yeah. So that changes a lot. So, but part of it is also like, how much would the Vikings have to pay in a Brock Osweiler style trade to just get $35 million of cap relief? Because they get that by trading Kirk Cousins right now. So Brock Osweiler, the what was it? The Texans paid the Browns a second rounder plus like a fourth rounder for a sixth rounder, to take on Brock Osweiler's like $16 million salary. So if a second rounder is worth $16 million, maybe it's not. I mean, there's been inflation and stuff. Like maybe you would pay 35, a first rounder to create $35 million in cap space. So that's something to take into consideration too. I think if you look at like market precedent, I would say Kirk is probably worth a mid first rounder, maybe a little bit more, just because I think it's a seller's market. And the fact that that's without assuming the Vikings take on any of his salary. If the Vikings do take on, like, they say they give him a $10 million bonus, they convert, 10 million of his $35 million salary into bonus, so that the next team gets Kirk Cousins on 1 year for 25 million. Maybe you get like a first and a second or a first and a third. I think that's possible, especially given that, like, the Steelers don't have a quarterback, the Buccaneers don't have a quarterback, Broncos don't have a quarterback. There are a lot of teams that are going to be looking to upgrade or move on or find something, and this is not the draft to find somebody pro ready to step right in it and take you to the promised land. So, in the draft with the quarterback class, so I think it's going to be a seller's market. So I wouldn't be surprised if they go a little bit above it. At the same time, though, I think Kirk is a more talented quarterback than Carson Wentz or than any of the other recent precedents. But at the same time, like, Kirk Cousins' contract is closer to a Jared Goff contract than it is to a Carson Wentz contract. So I don't think you get multiple firsts. But that's a different question than the question you asked, which is what's the worst offer that I would accept. I would not take less than a first rounder, because even if you get $35 million, it's going to take more than that to replace Kirk Cousins. I can understand people wanting to move on just because, you wanted to get a lottery ticket at a better quarterback. But even if you say, like, I want my lottery ticket in the draft, you're not going to be able to, like, draft unless you're very high on this quarterback class, which I'm not. I don't think you want to draft a quarterback necessarily in this draft early on. So, we're talking about, like, what kind of first rounder are you looking at? Like, is Kirk Cousins more valuable than, like, Trevor Lawrence was last year? Probably say Trevor Lawrence was more valuable last year as the number one overall pick, but is Kirk Cousins more valuable right now than Justin Fields right now? I would probably say I'd rather have Kirk Cousins, but that's a debatable question. And the Bears had to trade a first rounder, so they had to trade two first rounders to get Justin Fields. So if you think of Justin Fields at his rookie contract, granted, is worth two first rounders, and Kirk Cousins is worth like maybe one. So you would need to get, a decent return back. So you got to take all those things into consideration, plus the cap relief, plus everything else. So I'm talking a lot about all the things that go into it, but all that to just say, I think the market rate is like a first and a third. I would think very hard about. I think that's probably where I would pull the trigger as a first and a third. I think if I only get a first, and it would also depend on the first. Like if it's like the 25th pick in the draft, that's different than the 11th pick in the draft. It would need to be a mid or higher first round pick. So if I got the Panthers gave the 6th overall pick, I would do that. If it was like, the 15th overall pick and the 78th overall pick, I would probably do that. But that's kind of where I start thinking about, is this the right decision? And for all the factors I just mentioned, it sets you on a different contending window, but you also get all the cap relief, so all this other stuff. So but now you got to find a quarterback too. So all those factors come into play.
So the answer for you is mid first, right?
Yeah, mid first plus.
That's probably about it. For me personally, I look at where I think the Vikings are as a franchise, right? Which is, as somebody who rebuilding's kind of a weird phrase, but they at least need to take a step back, evaluate this roster, and make significant changes before they consider themselves strong contenders, right? I think that's something that we can both agree on. So I think I do like getting capital for Kirk Cousins, who's on the last year of his deal, and freeing yourself up cap space into the future. If we are taking on all of the money in this, if we are if we are I'm sorry, if we are freeing up $35 million in cap space, I think I could accept a second. I would like that to be in the vein of a Carson Wentz deal, where it's a second that potentially converts to a first. And then also a third round pick, or like a second and a third round pick, or something like that. I would say would be the minimum in the Carson Wentz deal. The thing I would like is to actually get a future first, right? If we're trading Kirk Cousins, I would rather target the 2023 first, because I don't think the answer is at quarterback in this draft class. So if we get the flexibility that the Eagles had for this year, where obviously it didn't really work out from the quarterback perspective, but they have 3 first round picks in the teens, right? You can easily package those to go up and get a very nice draft pick and a quarterback, basically whatever quarterback you want, I think, with those 3 first round picks, if you have those in the bag. So I guess for me, that's where I come from, where if we're saving $35 million, it's a second. If we're taking on any money in the deal at all, it has to be a first for me. Other than that, I just don't think it's worth it to save the cap space. I'd rather ride out his contract on 1 year and let him become a free agent and then get a third round draft pick and compensatory selection or whatever, right? So I guess that's the decision making process for me. There was another tangential question that we had in our notes that I skipped over, actually, about what you would pay Kirk Cousins on a contract. Let's say Kirk Cousins is a free agent all of a sudden, right? What is your ideal, average annual value on his contract? What do you think is fair for him?
Yeah, it's interesting because Mahomes and Josh Allen have kind of reset the market. Like the $35 million was kind of the average market, and then Josh Allen and Mahomes both came in with like 10-year, 8-year deals. So these are factoring in quarterback inflation. So I wouldn't go up to $45 million unless you also got a 10-year deal, which I obviously wouldn't do with Kirk Cousins, given that he's 34, I think. So I would probably go up to like 37. If somebody was willing, if the Jets were willing to come in and pay him 39, I'm not going to match that. Saved like 39 3 years or something. I'm not going to match that, but I do think 37 is probably fair and probably what he would get. He would probably get more than that on the open market, just because buyer's market, and there would be multiple bidders, and anytime there's multiple bidders, that's going to drive the price up. So I wouldn't be surprised if he went north of 40 million over like 3 years or something. So or even 4 or 5 years, if that's what he decided to accept. I think Kirk Cousins likes having shorter deals because it means he gets to re-up once the inflation hits again. So
which is extremely smart by him, by the way.
Oh yeah, he's done an awesome. I mean, you wish every other quarterback and every other player were as smart with negotiating. They're getting their money in the NFL. So he's done a great job. So that's probably where I would, and I wouldn't say. You're not getting any like extra benefit with a Kirk Cousins on $37 million a year, but I do think he's worth that on their team. You get $37 million worth of value out of Kirk Cousins because he's an exceptionally good quarterback. So, and it's the most valuable position in football. So, but you're just not getting any excess value out of that. So, what would you pay him?
Yeah, so this is a little bit hotter for me. I think that, and the way the Vikings structured his last contract kind of skews it a little bit, just because of the astronomical cap hit this season, right? If you look at his current pay rate of $33 million a year based on the extension that he signed, it was essentially a 2-year, $66 million extension where they did cap math. I think that is probably the range that I want to hit. And the reason is, I think there's not going to be, due to the economics of it, but I think there should be more stratification in the way quarterbacks are paid just based on their level of performance. I think we talked about how Kirk is not the elite quarterback who's going to give you that game-changing play. And that's why Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen are worth that $43 million a year, right? Once you get to that point, though, in the NFL, like, it really just looks at based on when the guys sign their contracts, right? Like Derek Carr earns $25 million a year, and he's on the last year of his deal, but he signed that deal before Kirk signed his deal with the Vikings. Right? Kirk's first deal with the Vikings was in the range of 27. When Kirk signed his second deal, he was just below Aaron Rodgers, who's making $33.5 million a year. If Aaron Rodgers were to get a deal now, it'd be north of $40 million for a very short term, right? Just because of how good he is as a player. But I think that you need to have that drop down to the Kirk Cousins range to make it worth it to have him on your team, honestly, because he's not elevating the pieces, and you need the extra money to put a strong supporting cast around him. So I guess I'm kind of out on paying a quarterback in Kirk's pay grade, right? In his ranking, which we talked about, the pay grade that he demands, which I agree would be at least that 37, 39, maybe $40 million on the open market for Kirk, right? So that's where I land, just below what it is, I think, for the risk reward value there. I at that point, I rather take my chance with rookies personally, but it's I don't think we're that far apart. I just think that, like, and the scenario I'm talking about will never happen, right? There's not going to be a world where you're going to be able to get away with paying Kirk $33 million a year on a contract extension. So I think that on my end kind of answers our final question here, right? So our final question is, if you're the Vikings GM, would you move on from or extend Kirk? And I would say let him play out the final year of his deal is a move on from Kirk situation in this instance. I
also don't feel like that's the worst option. Like, if they
Yes.
let Kirk play out his contract, you eat the entire cap hit, and you do it in a year where you're I don't know, maybe the Vikings think they're contending, but with this roster, you're sort of going all in on a bad roster. So you're kind of, in my mind, that's not a good use of his $45 million cap hit. So you're eating that, and then you just let him walk, and you don't get anything in return. I mean, he's a 10-year vested veteran, so the best comp pick you could get would be at the end of the 5th round. So effectively,
I didn't even realize that. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So, and I'm surprised. Like, I've seen like a lot of good, I don't want to name names, but I've seen like good reporters be like, this is the 3rd option. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, and also the 4th option is just cut him right now. But like, that's not realistically what the team is going to do. So, like, I don't think letting him play out his contract is an option, because you're leaving a 1st round pick or something, or even a 2nd round pick on the table versus getting nothing for him and him just walking. So, if you want to move on, I think you do it now with a trade. I don't think you let him play out his contract. Just a footnote, but
yeah. So the question: if you're going to move on, or are you going to extend him? My answer is pretty firmly in the move on range. I think I kind of got into it with what I would ideally pay Kirk, but I think the overall answer comes from what I was talking about earlier. The state that the Vikings are in as a franchise right now is somebody who needs to set at least a soft reset button, because we need to replace like half of our defense, right? I think the guys that we have under contract and our starters are going to be good there, and are going to fit very well in Donatel's system, but we still, like everybody else, we're losing, and we need to bring in guys for that. Our defense is not going to improve from the state that it was without that. Maybe, like, if our offensive line coach comes in and magically fixes the offensive line, we can have a top tier offense, but we still need work on the offense in terms of the offensive line as well, I think, right? So we have no money, and the best way to get money is by trading Kirk. And I think it kind of just naturally fits with, he's towards the end of his deal. You're hopefully, with the number of quarterback changes that we've seen just from retirements and other potential things, other potential movements this offseason, you're hopefully able to get a significant return for him. I think there is a point where, if it's like you're only getting a 3rd round pick in return, maybe you keep Kirk and let him play on the 1-year deal. I want to avoid extending him, because I don't think that because what extending is going to do is going to lead to a perpetual cycle of pushing money into the future, trying to nudge up and make things work against the cap year after year. And we've done that for 3 to 4 years straight, and it hasn't worked. And I don't think that is all Mike Zimmer's fault, like some people also seem to like to push. Right, so that's my answer, is pretty firmly trade Kirk. I don't know where you land, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the inputs. I'm probably more extend Kirk friendly, but if Kirk says I want Patrick Mahomes money or I'm walking, well, then I'm probably going to find a trade offer. And if the trade offers are, if Kirk's like, shoot, I'll sign for $35 million a year, I'm like, that's a pretty reasonable deal. But then if somebody comes along and says, hey, we'll give you 2 first rounders for Kirk, like, it's I would rather have 2 first rounders than Kirk on a very reasonable deal. So it depends a lot on the inputs. I think Kevin O'Connell is going to extend Kirk Cousins. I think that's the plan. I think the reason why is I really do think you can replicate the Rams model with the Vikings. I don't really like the heuristic of just what did the Super Bowl team do. We got to
Mhm.
do copy what the Super Bowl team did because everything that went right for them will also go right for us. Like that's
Yeah.
not entirely true, but you can look at the Rams roster and say like the Vikings have weapons the way the Rams do. Dalvin Cook, Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen, and some breakout guys. Irv Smith coming back. The offensive line needs to be fixed a little bit, but they got the bookends at tackle, it seems like, and Ezra Cleveland's a buildable piece as well. Maybe you get something out of Wyatt Davis or Oli Udoh with a better offensive line coach. That's relying on a lot of things to go well. It probably won't go that way, but like the thing about Super Bowl teams is they tend to get a lot of good luck, and right now the Vikings have not had good luck the last couple of years. Like if this defense is healthy the way that the Rams have figured out a way to make their teams consistently healthy, like Danielle Hunter isn't Aaron Donald, but he's probably not that far behind him in terms of like the blue chip defensive linemen in the
Yep.
NFL today. So, and we don't have a Jalen Ramsey, but we got a Harrison Smith and Eric Kendricks. It sounds like from Kevin O'Connell's presser that Anthony Barr will be back. Maybe we bring Patrick Peterson back. Got Michael Pierce, Dalvin Thomas. Like there are good players on the defense. It's just that most of them missed half the season or more. So, um, it's easy to say this team could surprise people if they were healthy, if they were a healthier version of themselves. We wouldn't be an 8-9 team. At the same time, like you can't just say like, well, if we get really really lucky, we'll win a Super Bowl. So I think like Kevin O'Connell is probably thinking like let's contend around Kirk. And I will say another thing: people say like you can't win with Kirk. There's a 0% chance. Well, like betting markets say you can win with Kirk Cousins because over the last 4 years in Minnesota, the Vikings have averaged an over 4% shot to win the Super Bowl, like based on preseason betting odds.
Hmm.
Like they were 10% in 2018 when they first signed Kirk. They bottomed out at 2.5, 3% last year, but like with 32 teams in the league, 32 like a 3% shot is average. So they've been average or above average every single year with Kirk Cousins as their quarterback. So like betting markets think the Vikings have a shot. Like the Bengals were like 1 in 150 shot chance to win the Super Bowl. So I think you can win with Kirk. It just requires a lot of luck, and this is a
Yep.
roster that's aging on, especially on the defensive side, lacking talent. I don't think it's really ready to contend. So with all that said, like I do think Kirk is a really good quarterback, and I think he makes more sense on a better roster, frankly. Like
Yep.
I don't think it was a mistake for the Vikings to sign Kirk Cousins back in 2018 because that roster was ready to have a good quarterback come in and take it to the next step, but it didn't work out. But that's how the NFL works sometimes. Sometimes you have a good plan and you don't get lucky. I think
Yep.
Kirk Cousins could easily lead the Broncos to a Super Bowl if they wanted to give up the draft capital for him. I think the same thing could be said of a lot of teams. So I think where the Vikings are at probably makes more sense to trade him. So I think the Vikings will probably extend him for a number somewhere north of 35 million. But I wouldn't be surprised if somebody came along in this buyer's market or the seller's market for quarterbacks and offered a first plus and said, "Hey, we'll also eat the 35 million because we've got the cap room for it." So. All that said, trade wouldn't totally surprise me. I'd still probably lean towards an extension because Kirk is like in my mind. I just explained why he's a top 10 quarterback, and if you have like a Philip Rivers or a Matt Ryan or somebody who's like not top five but just outside that, it's not a bad model to build around somebody who's really good if not elite, and you can
Yep.
build Super Bowl win teams around that. So that's a loosey goosey way of it's kind of a cop out because it depends on the inputs and it depends on what the contract looks like and it depends on what the trade offers most of all. But I do think they're moving towards extending him. I probably, given where I think the market will wind up, where the trade offers and where Kirk Cousins negotiations will wind up, I probably would lean towards trading him as well. Just because I think somebody's going to be, there's too many
Yep.
quarterback needy teams and not enough quarterbacks. I think somebody's going to end up being like, sure, we'll pay a first for Kirk Cousins. So,
Yep.
um,
So long and
I think
convoluted answer from Nick there, but the gist of it is he thinks the Vikings will extend. He would trade if what he assumes about the NFL to be true. But I think it's fair. to go through that entire discussion and decision making process, because these decisions are not made in a vacuum, right? Like, there is the context of what everybody else is offering and what the market is to consider when you're trying to make these decisions. So it's kind of fair to go through all of that stuff. One thing I did want to pull out there,
not like pro Kirk versus anti Kirk. That's not like
Yep.
the debate in the front office. It's like,
No.
what do we get for him? What are, what's the actual cost benefit analysis?
We need to evaluate our options, and like you mentioned, 2018 we evaluated our options and came to that decision, and I don't think it was necessarily a bad decision at the time. Like you said, it didn't work out. You know, and there were multiple, you know, valid decisions at that point in time. We went with one of the valid decisions that we could have made. The one thing I wanted to pull out is Kevin O'Connell wanting to work with Kirk, I think, and this is kind of more from earlier in the show, but something that Kevin O'Connell talked about in his presser, where he wants Kirk to play with a quieted mind, I think might be, if there is a key to unlocking Kirk, that might be it, where you get him in the correct mindset and he's not thinking and he's executing and he's kind of making those decisions. If you can shut his brain off that's trying to go through all of these little computational things and just kind of have him play in the flow of the game, and if Kevin O'Connell's able to unlock that, that maybe fixes the Kirk problem. Now, I don't think that's likely to happen, but it's at least an interesting call out there. Well, Nick,
the last time Kirk was in a McVay offense in 2015 and 2016 in Washington, he had the 5th best EPA per play. That was when he was not a very good quarterback. He was like an average at best quarterback, because that was when he was just his first full-time starter. And he made some plays and he showed some promise, but also he had zero pocket presence back then. He was a lot more limited. He was a lot slower to get through his reads. He's become a much better quarterback than the man he was in 2015 when he was just starting in the NFL almost a decade ago. So if McVay is, or if O'Connell's able to take that McVay offense, graft it onto Cousins, and elevate similarly the quarterback, it's going to be a much better end result, because he's elevating a much better quarterback. Like, if you're elevating the 15th best quarterback with the system to the 5th best results, well, if now you're getting like the 10th or 11th best quarterback and you're elevating that, well, then you probably get even better results. So you can certainly see the vision for building around Kirk Cousins, even if you think it probably makes more sense given the roster and the draft capital and the cap hits to move on at this point. So
yep. And
I can understand why the Vikings might decide to continue to build around Kirk Cousins, as much as fans seem ready to for the divorce. So.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair, and that, I think, will probably wrap up our Kirk Cousins discussion. This may be the longest podcast we've done yet. But
moratorium is back in effect.
Man, it was something. I mean, that was an absolutely phenomenal conversation. I had a fantastic time. Hopefully you all listening enjoyed it as much as we enjoyed talking about it. My name is Matt Freese. You can find me at Fries Football. He is Nick Olson at Nick Olson NFL. We are missing once again, and Greg would have been absolutely worn out from this conversation. Our co-host.
I don't think Greg is going to miss 90 minutes of Kirk Cousins.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. At You've Been Gregged, Twitter and Instagram there. You can find our podcast at Kindred Skulls on Twitter. You can also find it by searching YouTube for Kindred Skulls. We're available on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Please remember to leave us a 5-star review. We fixed Nick's mic issue. I didn't hear it a single time.
I did it for you. I did it all for the fan.
So
I'm running in the red on this podcast. So we live off your reviews. I go every day. I log into iTunes and I warm myself off to the sweet messages you leave us there. So.
There we go. If you have any other quality of life comments, in terms of the audio, we'll see what we can do. Let us know. We'll try to make it better for you. So, Skull Vikings, guys, and goodbye. We love you.
Goodbye, we love you.
The first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. And we'll all cheer on behind, and we'll score.